May 1945. Guernsey is loud with bells and Union Jacks. British troops come ashore at St. Peter Port to crowds 5 deep, women climbing onto railings, children waving flags they'd kept hidden for 5 years. Everyone agrees on what this moment means. Liberation, relief, the end of the only part of Britain the Germans ever occupied. Somewhere in that crowd, not arrested, not questioned, not even named in the newspapers, is a civil servant who had spent the previous 3 years running the island's aliens office. His office had compiled the paperwork. Names, addresses, occupations, religion. The list that, in 1942, told the occupying authorities exactly where to find the island's Jewish residents. He kept his job. Nobody in London moved to change that. For 30 years, the British government would actively work to keep the reason why out of the public record. This is the story of what no collaboration was built to hide, and the 3 women whose deportation papers were typed up not by the Gestapo, but by their own local government. Therese Steiner arrived in Guernsey in 1939, one of thousands of Austrian and German Jews who had fled after the Anschluss, scattering across Europe ahead of a war everyone could see coming but nobody could yet name. She was in her 20s. She found work as a domestic servant in childcare, most likely, in a household on the island, the kind of position that absorbed refugee women across Britain in those years, useful, invisible, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of an employer and the patience of an immigration system. Guernsey in 1939 was small, agricultural, insular in the literal sense, a place where everyone's business was known, where the post office, the parish church, and the harbor were the centers of a world that rarely extended past the mainland ferry. For a refugee from Vienna, it must have felt like the edge of the map. Safe in the way distance is safe. She had escaped one country's bureaucracy only to become, within a year, a line item in another's. When the Germans occupied the island in June 1940, Steiner, like every other Jewish resident, became someone the local administration now had to account for. Not hide, account for. The island's civil government, the States of Guernsey, continued to function under the occupation, as it did across the Channel Islands, a court sitting, taxes collected, ration books issued. Steiner's daily life, for a while, did not visibly change. She was still a domestic worker in a small community. She still went to the same shops, still knew the same faces. What she could not have known, what nobody in her position could have known, was that the office responsible for her registration as an alien before the war was the same office that would now register her as a Jew. In October 1940, the German occupying authorities issued an order. Jewish residents of the Channel Islands were to register with the local authorities, not the German military police, the local authorities. In Guernsey, that meant the aliens' office, the same civil department that had handled refugee paperwork for years, staffed by Guernsey civil servants, operating out of Guernsey government buildings. The order came from the Feldkommandantur. The list was compiled by islanders. 3 names on that list belonged to women with nowhere else to register: Therese Steiner, Auguste Spitz, Marianne Grünfeld, all refugees, all without British citizenship, all, by the spring of 1942, about to become the only residents of the British Isles ever deported to Auschwitz. The paperwork survives. That's the part that doesn't fit the version most people have heard. In April 1942, the German authorities ordered the deportation of all stateless Jews from the Channel Islands, a category that, conveniently, covered exactly the refugees who had no consulate, no government in exile, nobody to object on their behalf. Steiner, Spitz, and Grünfeld were collected, transported via St. Malo into occupied France, and from there into the deportation network that fed Auschwitz. None of the 3 survived. There is no record of any British-born Channel Islander being deported on racial grounds during the entire occupation. Here's where the received history starts to diverge from the documents. the standard account of the Channel Islands occupation, the one told in most histories until the 1990s, describes a population that endured, adapted, and occasionally resisted, under a German administration that operated largely independently of local government. The registration of Jewish residents is mentioned, when it's mentioned at all, as something done to the islands by the Germans, with local government as a passive conduit. The files tell a more complicated story. The aliens' office registration in 1940 happened before any German enforcement visit to individual households. The information, addresses, occupations, marital status, was already compiled, already filed, already available, by the time the deportation order arrived in 1942. The local administration did not invent the persecution, but it had already done the clerical work that made the persecution executable. After the liberation in May 1945, British military intelligence and the Home Office began compiling confidential assessments of conduct during the occupation, informally known within the files as suspected persons reports. These covered a wide range of behavior: black market dealing, fraternization, and informing. Islanders who had written to the German authorities reporting neighbors for hidden radios, for sheltering escaped slave laborers brought to the islands for German fortification works, for currency offenses. Some of those reported were sent to prisons on the continent. Some did not come back. The reports also covered the registration of the island's Jewish residents and the role of local officials in compiling it. And then at cabinet level a decision was made: no prosecutions. The reasoning, as it survives in the files, was not subtle. A public reckoning with collaboration in the only occupied part of Britain would be politically catastrophic, embarrassing for the island authorities who had continued to govern throughout, and crucially, would implicate too many people too far up the existing administration to make prosecution practical without unraveling Guernsey's entire civil government in the middle of a country trying to rebuild. There's a lot more in these files than made it into any post-war account: informer letters, internal Home Office memos arguing about how much to release, a deliberate decision about what story the public would be allowed to have. If the gap between what governments record and what they publish is the kind of history you want to keep following, this is a channel that spends a lot of time in exactly that gap. In 1975, the Home Office commissioned an official history of the occupation, written by the historian Charles Cruikshank. For nearly 20 years, it was the standard account, the book that libraries held, that journalists cited, that shaped the version of the Channel Islands occupation most people in Britain were ever exposed to. Cruikshank had access to government files that remained closed to everyone else. What the official history chose not to foreground was the extent of the registration process, the role of local administrative bodies in compiling it, and the post-war decision not to prosecute. The deportation of Steiner, Spitz, and Grünfeld appears, but as an episode, not as evidence of a system. It took until the 1990s for that to change. The historian Madeline Bunting, researching what became her 1995 book The Model Occupation, gained access to newly declassified Home Office files, the suspected persons reports, the informer correspondence, the internal post-war debate about prosecution. What emerged was not a story of mass collaboration in the sense of active ideological alignment with Nazism. Most islanders did not denounce their neighbors. But a meaningful number did, and the institutions that had governed the islands before the war continued to govern them throughout, including the institutions that processed the paperwork that made the deportations possible. The historian Frederick Cohen, working specifically on the Jewish experience of the occupation, drew the same conclusion from a different angle. The absence of any British-born deportee, set against the presence of 3 refugee deportees, was not coincidence. It reflected exactly who the local administration had been willing or required to give up, and who it had not. What the documents support, and what remains disputed, are two different things. Documented: the registration process, the deportation, the post-war non-prosecution decision, and the restricted access that shaped the 1975 official history. Disputed and likely to remain so. How much choice the island administrations genuinely had under German occupation, and where the line falls between bureaucratic compliance under coercion and collaboration in the fuller sense of the word. Historians continue to argue about that line, and the argument itself is part of the history now. Nobody was ever prosecuted for the registration or deportation of Steiner, Spitz, and Grünfeld. The civil servants involved largely continued in post-war public life on the islands. For decades, the three women were barely mentioned in local commemorations of the occupation, which focused, understandably, but selectively, on the privations the wider population had endured: food shortages, forced labor camps for foreign workers brought to the islands, the hardship of 5 years cut off from Britain. A memorial to Steiner, Spitz, and Grünfeld was eventually installed in Guernsey, decades after the war. A quiet acknowledgement, long after the people responsible for the paperwork were beyond accountability, and long after the version of events that omitted them had already become the one most people knew. The families of the three women received, in the years immediately after the war, very little. No detailed account of how the registration had worked, no information about the role of local government, just confirmation, eventually, that their relatives had been deported and had not survived. What the official record left out wasn't a secret in the sense of being hidden underground. It was a choice about what got published, what got commissioned, and who got access to the files that would have told a fuller story. That choice held for 30 years. Picture the crowd again, St. Peter Port, May 1945, flags and noise, and a population that had genuinely suffered under occupation, celebrating an ending it had earned. All of that is true. None of it is the whole picture. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, the registration forms for Therese Steiner, Auguste Spitz, and Marianne Grünfeld were still on record. Names, addresses, occupations, filled in by hand by people who were, that same afternoon, almost certainly somewhere in that cheering crowd. History doesn't always hide in silence. Sometimes it hides in paperwork that was never destroyed, just never read out loud.